What's so funny about mental illness?
When I'm depressed, there ain't nothing funny going on. It's like a block of cement. If I was ever depressed on a stage, I'd say, don't come to this show.
You're with All in the Mind on RN. I'm Lynne Malcolm. Today, some fascinating and darkly funny insights into being human from comedy writer and performer Ruby Wax.
I worked at TV for 25 years and then it suddenly came to an end, as all things do, and you're replaced by a firmer copy of you. And we girls, we should know that's coming. So get ready for reinvention. So it did come, and of course I'm shocked, because I look fabulous. But I started having to audition for playing me on television. So I thought, I got to cut this out, and suddenly the options are going on an island and eating a cockroach. But I'm too smart. So I was always interested in the brain, the mind, how we think. And so I went back to school and got a degree in psychotherapy, but I'm not a psychotherapist. I was terrible. I used to, when I had clients, I'd go, oh, come on, cut to the punchline.
After her short foray into psychotherapy, US-born comedian Ruby Wax concentrated on what she does best, making people laugh. For 20 years, she was the script editor for the sitcom Absolutely Fabulous with Jennifer Saunders and Joanna Lumley. In recent years, though, she uses her edgy, dark humour to raise awareness and break down the stigma surrounding mental illness. Her stand-up comedy shows and books have drawn on her and her family's lived experience. Her latest book is called How to Be Human, the Manual. She's teamed up with Buddhist monk Gelong Thubten and neuroscientist Ash Rampura. And she tells me they're pretty funny guys too.
I'm working with a monk and a neuroscientist. So the monk is really an expert on how we think, why our minds work the way they work. And then the neuroscientist points out where it is in the mind, where it is in the brain. Because, I'm not into the fluffy stuff. I want to know mechanically. You can't, but I'm always curious. Where do thoughts come from? When you feel something, where is it in your body? We forgot all this stuff on how to connect with each other. So the book about how to be human is saying it's not our fault because a lot of things really worked in the past, but they're backfiring now just because we were perfectly suited to survival, but emotionally we're in the dark ages. So it sort of explains, but except I'm a comedy writer. So, my thing is to spin the facts and turn them into comedy.
You've described where we are today in society as we're pumped on digital Viagra. What do you mean by that?
Look, I'm not complaining, because people go on whining about technology. And if you think it's fast now, wait till you see what's coming. I'm just saying, we are so technologically geniuses. We still have to remember what it's like to make us happy, to make us feel connected to people. If we don't do that, we'll go more into isolation and then play with your avatar of a mermaid, riding on a dolphin's back. We can go into fantasy pretty easily. And so the book reminds you of what originally we were supposed to be. We were supposed to live in a community. We live in a society now, each man for himself.
Ruby Wax has had a long career in comedy writing, and she's often performed her stand-up shows within psychiatric hospitals, playing to her tribe, as she says. She's become a mental health advocate, and it's inspired by her own lived experience of clinical depression.
Well, I wouldn't have gotten into this if, why fight a cause when you can't taste it? So I did, but I never told anybody. Luckily, it's sporadic, so I could go to work. I had one every 3 or 5 years, so you just say you have the flu. Then if you don't take medication, it gets faster and faster and deeper. And then finally, I had it for quite a long time, 5 months, about 10 years ago, and that's when I did change my life. I said, I got to study this, I got to figure this out. I can't make it go away, but I want to find ways outside of medication, because boy, do you need it if you're really mentally ill. I researched, and it turned out, this is a research, that cognitive therapy and mindfulness had the best results. That doesn't mean it works for everybody, but I became fascinated because I think we can do so much on ourselves, can't cure a disease, but boy, can you work those muscles in your brain so that you're not depressed about depression. Because the whole thing is, life is stressful. We got anxiety. People are tough. But it's the thinking that makes us really ill. The thinking, oh my God, I shouldn't be like this. Nobody else is like this. So our own thoughts are our worst enemy. And I've been working on this ever since.
Ruby Wax had quite a tough upbringing in Evanston, Illinois. She was an only child. Her father was violent and abusive, and she describes her mother as hysterical. But it was only recently, when Ruby Wax was featured in an episode of the UK TV show called Who Do You Think You Are, that she found out more about her parents' background. They were Jewish Austrians who fled from the Nazi threat in Austria in 1938.
My parents never mentioned their past. I just assumed that they were plonked down from a planet. And of course, when you're a kid, you think that's normal. A woman cleaning the ceiling with a Q-tip. And I was the only child, so I had nobody to compare notes with. Well, they had the accent, so my mother would go, civilized people don't bring sand in the building. I don't know if you're much louder. And she would go behind me with a sponge on a shag pile carpet, cleaning invisible mites off the floor, and made me take showers outside of our house before I came inside of my house. Everything covered in plastic, including my grandmother. Hysterical, the voice and the panic. She had that. It was wild. I was saying, once she'd come to England, and I kind of have this too, she'd have an obsession. And so one year she came and she went, do you have a broom? So I said, yeah, I got a broom. She said, I don't want that broom. I want the one with the bristles, the one that looks more like a witch's broom. I want that broom. So she couldn't stop talking about it for 10 days, going, did you get the broom? So I'd go, yeah, I'm getting it. What kind of broom? And then she'd draw it on walls. This kind of broom, the one with the bristles. So she goes back to Chicago and she calls me a few days later going, did you get the broom? And I said, no, I will be getting it. She said, oh, when are you getting the broom? Oh, your aunt died. So I said, what did you just say? And she said, okay, back the clock up 24 hours. She's not dead. Now, did you get the broom? These are samples of madness. Yeah.
So you found
And my dad was, then I found out how they had to get out of Vienna. And my dad had to use his wits, and it was a 1 in a million chance how he got out. First, he got an airplane out of Austria to get to Belgium. Nobody gets an airplane. He didn't have any money. We're still wondering, how did he get the airplane? And then he stows away on a ship. First, how did he get on? How did he get off? So he's got a killer instinct. The thing is, now you're an American, you're safe. But he still kept pushing. So I was raised with this violent wish to conquer. And that's including me, and I was a huge disappointment.
And your parents, you found out that your parents would have gone through a lot of trauma, but you also found out that both your great-grandmother and your great-aunt spent time in the same insane asylum.
Yeah, they called it an insane asylum. Now you'd be sued for that. My mom didn't tell me anything about my past, and when she was in the hospital, really out of it, I went into our attic, which I'm not allowed. I didn't even know we had an attic, but there was a door that she never allowed me into, and I went up there, and there was a suitcase, one of those leather-bound ones, and I opened it, and there were hundreds and hundreds of photographs of people I don't know who they are, and letters. So when the Who Do You Think You Are people came, I handed him the suitcase. Well, for a year, they get the greatest genealogists to put this together. Then they take you, but they never tell you where you're going. And they reveal it while you're on camera. They said, your great-aunt was in an insane asylum. She had agitation. Isn't that a great word? That's what they called madness. She was in there for 30 years. So then they say, and here's your great-great-aunt. And I said, please, was she an actress? And they said, no, she was in an insane asylum too. And we went to visit these insane asylums, which are still working. And they wanted me to cry, and I'd be really sad, but I wasn't. I'm very comfortable in an institution because I'm with my people. So when I was there, I thought, why would I cry? They were safe here. And, the treatments weren't up to date. They did things like put you in warm water. Didn't work, clearly, but they thought, but leave them for a few days. But she would have been with her own people. She would have killed herself if she was walking around in normal life. And another thing is, I went to the graveyard where they were buried and there was no stone. And I think it was because everybody was so embarrassed that they were in an insane asylum. There was no stone, it was just dirt, but they knew they were buried there. So since then, I've bought them a stone. And it says on it how proud I am of them.
Oh, So how has understanding your
So
ancestors
understanding that, yeah, that's better than
you?
50 years of therapy.
It's helped you to understand yourself?
Well, understand what came down through the blood line, but also things aren't necessarily passed genetically. I mean, chances are pretty high if you're past that gene that provides you with a full array of mental illnesses. But if I had 5 brothers and sisters, they wouldn't all have it. My grandmother was totally resilient. But it looked like it was a lot of people. And then if you have the gene and you have a really violent upbringing, bingo, chances are big you're going to have depression. But it made me, when I saw how hard it was for my mother to get out, and she was beautiful. I mean, this woman was a goddess and also was brilliant. My mom was the first one in a line that went to university, and then suddenly she has to go in the peak of her life. I could see why she was mad, angry mad.
And some of that background that your parents went through, really, even though they didn't talk about their background, it came through when you were a kid, didn't it? Because you found yourself as a child behaving in a paranoid way and behaving as if you were going through a similar experience to what they'd gone through.
But they brought the war to the table. It was like I always felt air raid sirens going off. Everything was an emergency. Even when I got up in the morning, Ruby! That would me going to school. So I felt war in my head. They psychologically brought it to the kitchen nook. Anyway, it's over. The war's over. And part of this book, as I go from evolution to how we think, to where emotions come from, our relationship to our body, eventually it goes into compassion. And there's a chapter on that. And the final chapter is forgiveness. Well, when I decided I'd end the book on that, I had nothing to forgive. And so I explained the peeling down, and then eventually, your past is your past, but everybody's got a story. So in the end, you open up, and it's a muscle that you have to work, this thing to forgive or to have compassion. To a lot of us, it's very hard to switch those qualities on.
You're with All in the Mind on RN. Lynne Malcolm here, and with me is comedy writer and performer Ruby Wax. Her latest book is How to Be Human, the Manual, in which she collaborates with a neuroscientist and a Buddhist monk to gain insight into the modern human mind.
First of all, I had to find state-of-the-art neuroscientist. I accidentally met this guy and then threw myself at his feet. A, he's hilarious, which you need in this book. And B, he's young and he's really good looking. But, I don't want to say this. I'll say it in Australia because he's already cocky. But he's a professor and a neuroscientist and a neurologist, and he's sort of top of his game. And everybody that I admire, like the Mick Jaggers of neuroscience, he's worked with. So he doesn't have to look up stuff. When you say, I said to him, do we have an asshole gene? And he'll give me the answer. And then, of course, my job is just, not always, because I think I like to do information, really fascinating information, and then spin it into funny. And the way those two talk to each other is great. I can spill it now. There's a chapter called Sex, right? Maybe I shouldn't say that. And at the top I go, so Tupten, that's the monk. I said, when was the last time you had sex? He says, 25 years ago. And then there's 3 blank pages, and I say at the bottom, well, that about covers it. But they have a great relationship. And they're hilarious. But you do get what the mind does and what the brain does. And there was a marriage. These two guys really understood each other.
Why did you make the decision to bring a neuroscientist and a Buddhist monk together?
Well, I'm covering all bases. This is not a New Age ting-ting book. You go to that New Age section or self-help and you can cover the equator 57 times. But I thought, give them science, give them the real thing, which is fascinating enough about how the brain can change, that we're not born with, who we are, like how malleable the brain is and how you can change it. I mean, that's fascinating. And I mean, you really can take control of the wheel to a point. I mean, suddenly you're not going to be Albert Einstein, but if you do the right exercises, you got more elbow room. Now, who's going to know more than a neuroscientist? And then, of course, a monk understands their whole ethos is how we think, how human nature behaves. And, of course, they do meditation. At the end of the book, he gives mindfulness exercises, and so do I, but the book isn't about mindfulness. It's just, it happens to have the greatest results. I'd say to the monk, if you ever use the B word again, because sometimes he says Buddhism, and I won't tolerate that because I'm not a Buddhist, but I do mindfulness, which is the Western. Of course, it stole from that, but it's a Western version.
So what does mindfulness mean to you?
Oh, God, this is so hard. To me, it's mental training. It's just like going to the gym, where you get a six-pack if you keep doing it. So if you do certain exercises, which that's the problem, they're not hard to do, but you have to do them every day, as I said. And that's why most people fall short, because we want people to fix us. Well, in this case, you have to do it yourself. But what it trains you to do is to be more aware of what your thoughts are. It is cognitive therapy. Aware if you are caught in a habit. Let's say every time you see somebody walk on the other side of the street, and let's say they don't notice you, if you keep thinking, it's because they hate me, eventually, not everybody does, but some people get caught in that loop of saying, this is the way it is, I'm always victimized, this always happens to me. Well, you can change that, and when you do change it, people's reactions to you also change. Same with your kids. If you really get in a bind of this is the way they are, then you've locked them in. So the neuroscientist gives the evidence of this thing called neuroplasticity, how to do it, what your brain looks like when it's changing. Then, of course, the Buddhists, the whole reason for mindfulness is to change your mind, to expand it and not just be caught up in, oh, I'm like this, doing the same thing every day. You imprison yourself. But there is a key to get a much wider lens on the world, and that's freedom. You want to talk about happiness? It means you're flexible. You know where you come from. I mean, I still have the voices in my head. I'm not making sense. Nobody likes me. I'm a failure. But you have a different relationship with those voices. Everybody's got negative voices. In the book, the neuroscientist explains why, and it's, again, for our survival. But a lot of us live with these negative recordings. There is totally a reason for it, but you learn to live with it. You sort of watch your habits, and by noticing, the habits break. If you unconsciously smoke a cigarette, you'll keep smoking. But when you really notice what you're doing without kicking yourself in the behind, because that's the main thing, is most of us, when we get the thoughts, I shouldn't be thinking like this. I'm now anxious about anxiety. You learn to get the shouldn'ts out. It just comes in going, you're an idiot. And you go, yeah, I know you from, 20 years ago. Keep playing, and eventually those thoughts become background music, and you can get on with what you're doing. They don't interfere so much.
And there's a section too on the relationship between the mind and the body and how interlinked they are. How does mindfulness help that awareness?
Well, again, it's not all day. People jump to conclusions. You don't do sit-ups all day. By enhancing those muscles, and getting them stronger and stronger in your brain. You do, if you want to, a few times a day. You check the weather outside. Well, you learn to check it inside when you have to. So I'll just go to something else. If you have a meeting with your boss, you notice that your mind is in full red mist. Well, the noticing means that you can now get your breath back and make sense in that meeting. So the same thing with checking in on your body. If you notice, also if you're going in a meeting or you're walking down the street and your shoulders are hunched up, and your fists are clenched and you've stopped breathing, you'll only notice that if you become conscious of it. And they do say that the body and the mind are the same thing. As a matter of fact, there's a brilliant TED Talks of the relationship with the mind and the body that says if you change the posture of your body, the mind automatically changes. As a matter of fact, there's an experiment where they this is really true, put pencils in people's mouths, not pointing in, but, sideways, and it makes them smile, and they do tests on whether that affects their positivity or negativity. And the results are pretty good. I'm not saying stick a pencil in your mouth. I'm just saying if you work from posture, you have more of a chance. Of course, again, it's mental training. It's noticing how you walk, how stooped you are. Hunch over, stop breathing, and notice how your mood changes. Put your shoulders up and breathe. And maybe even relax your face. Watch what happens. Now, that doesn't say it cures mental illness. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the general public with anxiety.
And so you talk about mindfulness being helpful for your mental health, but it's not the answer, is it? As somebody who has chronic depression, for example, would find it really difficult to even sort of take the first step.
If you're in the hub of depression, you shouldn't do anything because your mind is in full attack. So you don't want to look in and notice your thoughts. It's like, war has begun. You can see the troops coming at you because that is the disease, is your mind turns on you. Do not do mindfulness. I say don't even do therapy. And if anybody says you should take up jogging, tell them, to F off. But once you're out of the depression, you can go back to the gym. But listen, mindfulness isn't for everybody. I can't do yoga without breaking my spine in 3 places. But the general public, it has pretty good results. This is just from research, not because, I had a weekend workshop and thought, I had some messages from an angel. The results are really interesting when you look at a brain in a scanner of somebody even who did 2 days of mindfulness. The brain changes. That part that reacts to fear, it lowers down. The cortisol that makes you hysterical when you get anxious, it's not because a little thought bubble came in your head. Your whole body is flooded with a chemical. So it's to me, knowledge is freedom.
Mm-hmm. So how do you manage your depression now?
I don't have depression now. A depressive doesn't live with depression all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But for 10 years now, I can feel it coming because I do take my temperature inside, and there's a different quality in just my normal thoughts of saying you're a failure, nobody likes you, this isn't making sense. Those are my normal, that's my background music. But when you get depression, the thoughts, it changes, they become more abusive. If you really notice it, if you've got depression, your hair changes its quality. My saliva dries up, you start to notice, okay, it's coming. It's like an earthquake in its early stages. In the past, I would make myself busier and busier because I wanted to show the world I was perfectly fine. Well, that really stirs up the cortisol. Now, when I notice it coming, everything shuts down. I'll remove myself. This is the problem with people at work. They might not be able to. If work let them off for a few days, the cortisol would be able to at least come down and they could get their medication straight if they really have it. They're not just having a bad hair day. I checked into a retreat last time. I let those voices, that's the disease. Lewis Walport says, what a tumor is to cancer, thought is to depression. But it passed after 5 days rather than 5 months. It's just as agonizing, but you just hold it. You know the thoughts are the disease. The thoughts are the disease. The thoughts are the disease because we always think when we're in it, it'll never go. They do go. Otherwise, you'd never recover. And that's the type of disease that's episodic. So I do feel, listen, tomorrow it's going to hit me, but I can catch it early and then go away from all media, all digital, because that's just another addiction. Then when I'm okay again, I can go back into the race. This is about saying, okay, pull on the brakes now. Learn how to drive yourself like a car. Because eventually, if you keep the pedal down, you'll run out of petrol.
I wondered whether Ruby Wax feels that being a comedian is related in some way to her troubled family life when she was growing up.
You mean growing up in a hurricane? In Evanston?
Yes.
I don't know, because Jennifer Saunders is one of the most boring people in real life. She had a totally normal background. You can't say who gets this gene. I'm dyslexic, so when I write comedy, I'm really trying to write sentences, but it comes out, it's more like jazz, and that is comedy. It's putting these juxtapositions together that you think, where'd she get that one? So I wouldn't say my background fed into it. You don't necessarily have to come from a crazy place. It does give you good material if you're writing a book about your parents. But that was the first book I wrote called How Do You Want Me? So I already got it out of my system. The greatest lines of my parents. You don't even have to edit them. Straight onto the page. They were geniuses. It's genius when you write it down because you think, surely Ruby's making this up. Nope, came straight out of their mouth. because of the way I think and the way I write, it does come out funny. So I use that and stick it on top of really interesting stuff.
Were you always a funny kid?
No. It turned on at about 16 when I couldn't get any of the boys and I wasn't really good looking. My teeth were, I always say, were in another time zone in front of my face. And my mother cut my hair in a bowl shape to make me even more attractive. So I couldn't get any of the boys. And then I think it was one night I turned into Joan Rivers. And then I did get the boys. But most of them ended up gay. But that's not the point. The point is I had all the beautiful blonde boys. So I turned it on for a reason. It must have been lurking. But it was motivated by trying to get some attention. And it does get attention.
And do you think that being a comedian has been protective for you and your mental health in some way?
Well, when you're really sick, your mind doesn't know what you do for a living. When I'm depressed, there ain't nothing funny going on. It's like a block of cement. If I was ever depressed on a stage, I'd say, don't come to this show. You know, I don't make myself laugh. Then when I came out of the depression, then I have this, I've got this thing about writing comedy. I can do that.
So you don't think that at any stage
not that
being
it's
able
1 in
to
4.
laugh or being able to make other people laugh has actually
makes
helped
you better?
keep
No.
you buoyant? No?
Not at all.
No.
It's a job. And it's like I always say, 1 in 4 people have mental illness. There's not that many funny people. No, it doesn't. It doesn't make me laugh. As a matter of fact, what happens when you do get depressed is other people will know, is you can't write anymore. Of course, I love that the neuroscientists can explain what happens physically. Is your hippocampus, it's your memory, goes down when you're too flooded. So that's why even if you're a genius novelist, you can only write and then the door opened, you've lost it, and that exasperates it. So if you were really talented and you've got depression, you're going to stab yourself even more when you lose it.
So what's next for you in the future in terms of mental health campaigning and what you think the key issues are that people need to be more aware of?
That's such a bizarre word, mental health. I'm talking about how you think. Why we think the way we think. That's, to me, fascinating. It's the human condition. It always sounds, when you say mental health, as if I'm writing about depression. It's not part of my campaign to write how to be human. That's my interest, and it covers everybody. I'm going to tour this show like I do every other show. I steal my own lines from the book, but obviously I add stuff. So my next show is, in the second half, rather than the audience talking, I'm bringing out the monk and the neuroscientist. And we have a 3-way. We'll bring that to Australia.
Great.
And as I say, they're great comedians. I have to say, I've picked some. Our relationship is, we're married. That's what we are. And it's like a married couple. We know what the other one's thinking and take the piss out of each other.
Thank you very much, Ruby. That's been terrific to talk to you.
Thank you.
Ruby Wax's new book, How to Be Human, The Manual, is published by Penguin, Random House. And if you'd like to see a video interview I did with Ruby Wax a few years ago, head to the All in the Mind website where you'll find a link to it. Thanks to producer Diane Dean and sound engineer Mark Don. I'm Lynne Malcolm. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.